And we're live. Hello, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. Welcome to Debut Spotlight. I'm the author of the forthcoming novel Atomic Anna, and today my guest is Destiny Birdsong. She is the unbelievable author of this amazing book, Nobody's Magic. It just came out yesterday. It is so good. You need to run and get a copy now. Before we start talking to Destiny, and I have so many questions, I have to confess that I'm worried about fitting this all into 30 minutes, but I'm going to do it. But before we jump in, I'm just going to read her bio and introduce you to her, to those of you who haven't heard of her. Destiny O. Birdsong's writing has appeared in the Paris Review Daily, African American Review, and Catapult, among other publications. She's received the Academy of American Poets Prize and the Richard G. Peterson Poetry Prize. Her critically acclaimed debut collection of poems, that's right, she's an amazing poet, was longlisted for the 2021 PEN Volcker Award. She also has her MFA and PhD from Vanderbilt. Destiny, this Nobody's Magic, this book is just amazing. Please tell our listeners, what is this about?
So it is a triptych novel. So it's a novel that told in three parts about three Black women with albinism who live in my hometown or have connections to my hometown, which is Shreveport, Louisiana. I think if I had to say something sort of overarching about all three of the stories, like all three of the women are really sort of at critical moments in their lives where they're having to choose what they want the rest of their lives to look like, and sometimes that's in the wake of loss, in the wake of some kind of disappointment, or in the wake of some new revelation. And so each of the triptychs is really just about those journeys. Like, they're figuring out, how do I want to live? Who do I want to live with? Who do I want to be? So yeah.
Three strong, amazing women. They just pulled me in from the very beginning. And I read that you actually started with Agnes, and yet
Mhm.
she's the third in the story, right? You start off
Mhm.
with Suzette. How did you get from Agnes? Like, how did that work, the evolution of these three stories?
Mhm. Word. Well, Agnes last because I think that out of the three, she is, I think, the easiest character to hate. I think, Agnes is a lot. And so I think she comes last in part because I wanted to sort of ease readers into um into her story at least. So I started with Agnes. It really just started as like an idea for a short story. And I was like Agnes. I was away from home doing work that was very taxing and stressful. And I just thought, I just had this idea, like, I wonder what would happen if, like, someone in this space sort of just leaned into their basest impulses. And Agnes was born.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
So I have to tell you, I was just drawn in from page 1 to Suzette. And I know she comes first, and like maybe that's obvious, but and
Mhm.
then when I read that you had started with Agnes, I was like, really? But Suzette, I just felt like, but I just want to give the listeners an example of your voice, because the strength of your writing, of course, is the stories behind these women, but the voice
Mhm.
is unbelievable. And it's where you truly shine as a poet. I mean, your control of language, the way you shape it into these women is just, it blew me away. I can't even say that enough. So I just want to
Thank
read
you.
the first sentence from each of these three stories for the listeners so they get a sense of how different the voices are. And I want to tell everybody, this is so hard to do as a writer, to have these three distinct voices. Oh my God, this is impressive. So you start off with, I didn't really kick it that much before Donnie because I felt like I had everything I needed right where I was. I still live at home, and my daddy owns Elkin Custom Auto, so we do pretty good. It's like, wow, you know your character right from those first words. And then the second one starts off, the idea to get head from some rando was mommy's. Shortly after we got high off of one of her other ideas, weed infused chocolate chip cookie dough while binge watching Atlanta. Oh my God, right? You know, you're in a whole other world right there. And then we move on to Agnes, and you start off and you wrote, Agnes Cherie Kirkendall always panicked a little when she wrote her name in perfect capital letters in blocks at the top of a Scantron. The extra K always threatened to keep it from fitting in. the same way it had 2 decades before at her high school in Louisiana, the first place where someone made a connection between her name and her skin. Wow. So can you please, I'm like dying to ask you this, like, how did you master these three totally separate voices? Teach me, please.
Well, I mean, I think that the truth is just, being a Black person who often has to code switch, like I have a voice, I have language that I use in spaces where I feel really safe with my friends and my family and people I love. And then I have there's sort of other range that there's a spectrum of voices, right? There's the way I talk to students when I'm teaching a class. There's the way I speak to people in job interviews. There's the way I speak to people who are strangers over the phone. And then there's the way I speak to people who I kind of know, but like not, like we're kind of cool, but I don't know you like that. And so I think it really was sort of tapping into all three of those. For Suzette, especially though, I wanted her because I think Suzette is such an amazing storyteller. Um, I wanted her to sound like the people who told stories to me when I was a kid. So she sounds like me and my family at home. And I think that one for me was the hardest to put on the page because there's a rhythm that you just kind of hear in the language. And so I was always kind of checking in with that. Yeah,
But that was
yeah.
the hardest because I felt like that one just, I mean, it read like I was sitting next to her, just listening to her talking to Drina and, her mom and dad. And
Yeah, that takes work.
yes, it does. Yes, it does. And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
can see you put in the hours and hours and hours. Really, it paid off. So I want to talk to you about the title itself, right? Nobody's
Mhm.
magic. So there are a lot of references to magic in there and voodoo with Suzette and stuff. So could you please talk about magic? Why magic?
Yeah. People with albinism, and particularly Black people with albinism, have a complicated relationship with magic, right? I've talked about this before, but one of those complexities is sort of the layers of like Black girl magic, right? I think Black girl magic is great. Sometimes it gets conflated with melanin magic, and that's where I get uncomfortable because that excludes me. Um, in another sense, and you get some of this in Suzette's story, like depending on where you are in the world, like having albinism could put you in grave danger. There are countries on the African continent that where people believe that like people with albinism's body parts are have power, and so they will chop them off. They'll sometimes kill the person, sometimes not, but they will take the body part to use in different, rituals and ceremonies. And so my relationship with magic is complicated. And I chose the title because, I don't think these women really belong to anybody. They are Black women. But I think that their stories belong to them. And particularly writing about people with albinism when so much of literature marginalizes us and excludes us. It's like, here's some magic here's some magic that belongs to these women, like that nobody gets to co-opt or own or sort of use for their own purposes. So that there's so many reasons why the title is what it is. We could talk all day about that, but yeah, I think those are sort of the major those were the major sticking points for me when we were choosing the title because I had to rename it. It was originally called Dream Girls, and we thought a better name. We thought something a bit more specific might be really good, and so yeah, yeah,
But
it
I
came
love
out of
it.
that process.
So I love that explanation. And also specifically with Suzette, you really wrote to her growing up, her sort of coming of age and realizing this idea that other people had about what her magic might be, right? So people who were, there's this sort of scary moment where some people think that they can take her eyes, right? And you really tie this magic and albinism to sight. Can you talk about those connections and how they all come together?
Definitely. So, many people with albinism, I can't speak for all of them, usually also have ocular albinism, which sort of changes. Um, what I've read, it's interesting. So, your fovea is not always fully developed at birth. And then also, sometimes the nerves in your eyes are routed in a different way. So, like, sometimes my friend can point out a bird and say, hey, look, there's the bird. And it takes me a few seconds to actually like discern the bird. And some of that is about visual acuity, but some of that may also be about how the nerves in my eyes speak to my brain. Um, and so sometimes people with albinism will, they might be legally blind, they might have partial vision, they might, like me, like my vision is not 20/20, but it is well enough for me to drive. Like with contacts, corrective lenses, all of that, all of those things. So I think that was an important conversation for me to include in the book. I can't I am not a legally blind person, so I didn't necessarily feel comfortable telling a story about a person with albinism who had those particular challenges, but I could talk about issues with sight. And so I think that's why it's kind of woven into all of the stories. I think there's also a moment in Maple's story where she kind of
Yes.
capitalizes on the presumption that she can't see to get something that she
Yes.
wants to see. So yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, yes. But I have to say, there's like, there's the real world connection, but then there's also the thematic, like write a, paper, go home and write a 10-page paper on the theme of sight in this book
Mhm.
and in each of these stories too. I mean, it just, you folded that in beautifully to what we see in the world. So were
Thank you.
you, were you also thinking about that as the theme? I'm assuming I'm not just putting that out there, right? I mean, that was in your head.
I think, and you probably know this as well. Sometimes you start a story and you just have the story, and right, and like as you have it, and as you draft and develop, these other things come into play, and you start to notice things.
Yeah.
I believe that my work is way smarter than I am. So like it teaches me things like as I am working with it, it's teaching me what it's going to be, and I'm also doing my shaping and digging into my toolbox and stuff. So I don't know that, because Agnes's story is first, and I think that's sort of where you get the least of that conversation in terms of sight. I wasn't
Uh-huh.
thinking about physical sight in her narrative, but I was thinking about insight, which Agnes just doesn't have. She's working on it, right? Like she's part
Yes.
of her story is about her gaining insight. And so that was very clear to me that I did want to write about that. And I think when I got to Suzette, and I needed to sort of like, in some ways make a case for her like cloistering, like for her being sort of kept away from people. The issue with eyes and her sight, was not only useful, but I think it really sort of spoke to her like subjectivity, and
Yes.
also, yeah. And there are also stories I heard as a kid about people. There was like a big crime when I was younger about women who had gouged out the eyes of another woman in a city close by, and so like that
Oh,
also
right.
had that also had some
Mm.
resonance in terms of like how I wanted to shape that
Yeah.
particular moment in her narrative. It felt important to include the conversation about physical vulnerability as a person with albinism, and also tie it to some larger cultural um, practices.
Yeah. So I like that you said your stories are smarter than you sometimes.
Yeah, all the time. Yeah, the
Rings
puns are
true.
cute.
Rings
Yeah,
true. Like,
yeah, they're
yes, I
always
did
smart.
mean that. Well, so it really
Yeah.
spoke to me. So I can't remember which story this was in. Well, first of all, in every story, there's makeup, and I think every one of your characters goes to Ulta, right? Or talks about it. And there was this phrase that I wrote down, and I didn't write what page it was on, but you wrote, your character put on a palatable public persona. And I know this was
Yes.
because she was, dealing with her albinism and she wanted to paint on her eyebrows and stuff. But
Mhm.
for me as a woman, it spoke to me, a woman, that is not dealing with albinism, is not born albino, like the idea of putting on my palatable public persona too, right? I mean, I
Mhm.
put on lipstick to get on
Mhm.
this, to get on today. I think
I
that
did
speaks.
too.
Yes, it speaks to a lot of people. So there's this power of makeup that you recognize in there. Can you talk
Mhm.
about it?
Yeah, definitely. Like, um, I also like my brows are not this color. They are very light. I didn't put on mascara today, so you can see my little blonde lashes, and like that's the color of thought it was the color of my body hair. And so, I am often thinking about makeup, but also just about beauty, like it.
Mhm.
Only very recently have I started to see representations of people with albinism in spaces where there are also representations of beauty, right? So they're like models now, and like you'll see them in like music videos, and it's so wonderful. But I think that I struggle and still do sometimes with my own sort of like the different ways that I can express my beauty, whether I'm wearing makeup or not wearing makeup, or wearing mascara or not wearing mascara. I think because my difference is on my skin, I've had a long history of the gaze, and gazes of all kinds, right? And so I think that it is hard to live in a body where that is always happening, and like not be thinking about that, or like not be thinking about beauty or anything
Mhm.
like that. I also want to say really quickly that people a lot of people have described this book as like romance, and there's certainly romance in it, but I think the reason that I wanted romance to be there is because I wanted in each of the narratives for there to be someone who desired the main character, right, and who sort of was able to perceive her beauty in addition to her albinism, not like in spite of, or like not past or anything. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in erasing one part of your identity in order to sort of be seen. But they were seeing that, and so and
That's
I think that
beautiful,
also
by
sort
the
of
way, that you believe you don't want to erase them, right? Because it is who you are. It
mhm,
is, you can't erase some
exactly.
part. You can't look
Yes,
past it. That's the person.
yes. For
Yeah.
him, looking past it is looking past a part of me, a really
Yeah.
important part, not the totality, but a very important part. Yeah, yeah.
I
So
love that. That's great. Okay, so I'm glad you brought up romance, because I was going to ask you, the next question is about, there's a lot about the relationship between we'll say falling in love, but also men and women. In this last one, like, what is the role of a man in a woman's life, right? Is it the gaze, right? There are men, women. Oh, I see you're making this face. Get ready. Here it comes. So in the last story, Agnes writes, no one's, or you write, she says, no one suspected she made so little money that living with a man was more of a financial than a romantic decision. And I just thought, more people should be talking about that, writing about that. I think that this is not uncommon for one person to live with another because they just can't afford something else. And I
mhm.
think you captured that relationship, and that, how much you can hate that, sort of the interior monologue that goes along with that, really well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I had an old friend who used to say this phrase, when he would see two people together and he didn't think it was a love match. He would be like, "Yeah, that's for the sake of stability." And like
Right.
my friend and I like co-opted that phrase, and so whenever we saw it happening, we'd be like, "Yep, sake of stability."
Stability.
And that's a real thing, I think. Yeah, I think that it is something that we should talk about honestly when we talk about relationships, and it's not always romance, and in that particular case, that's actually from Agnes's story. In that particular case, the lack of romance is mutual. Like, I think the
Right.
person that she's living with she also serves a purpose for him. And sometimes that's just how it is. I mean, my hope for Agnes, because I am a hopeless romantic, my hope is that I don't want to give away any spoilers, but whatever happens after the end of her story, romance is also present. But yeah,
Okay.
that's just kind of how things are, and it's sort of a part of the kind of disaster that is her life. Is that she's found herself in that particular situation, which in itself isn't bad, but the way that she's being treated in addition to that, right, is the
Hmm.
issue. But
Hmm.
and just kind of the tacit understanding that she can be treated that way because she has fewer options, or at least she
Yeah.
believes she does. Yeah.
But in all three of these stories, right, you don't fall into this trap I hate, of the like happily ever after, we're all in this for love. It's like, okay, because at the end of the day, you have to pay for your rent and you have to pay for food, right? You've got to pay for the internet connection, making this interview possible. Like,
Mhm.
right? I mean, this is real
Mhm.
life. And I feel like you really got that in there, that money does matter in your decisions. It's not just love.
Yes.
And I really appreciated that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I want to go to another one of my favorite passages. It's on page 114 for anyone who's listening. I'll read it. So I'm such a northeastern white middle-aged woman, so you're gonna have to excuse my reading, but I thought this was so good. You wrote, listen, if you're really trying to grow up, if you're really trying to be a functioning adult, you got to understand that don't nobody do nothing for free. Everybody wants something, and you got to figure out what you want to give them. You can't be bopping around the world thinking everybody operate out of the kindness of their hearts. Ain't nobody like that. Nobody. And it ain't bad to want nothing neither. It's not what you want that's the bad thing anyway. It's what you willing to do to get it. For me,
Mhm.
that was the most powerful passage in this entire book, I have to
Oh,
say.
wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
It's Trina. That's Trina and Suzette, right?
yes,
Yeah.
it
Yeah. That's
is.
in the
It is.
first.
It's
Yeah.
Trina, another love story.
Mhm.
Um, and and I wanted to ask you, I mean, this idea that there's nothing for free, and what are you willing to give up to get what you want? That is a
Mhm.
theme in all three of these books. Please
Yeah.
tell me how you thought about this as you were writing or afterwards.
You know, again, I think it's one of those things that just sort of comes out of my own history, like my mom was very realistic about that. And I appreciate it. And she used to tell us often, the world owes you nothing. Like it owes you nothing and it's probably not going to give you anything.
Hmm.
Everything you get, you are going to have to figure out how to get it, right?
Yeah.
But there was also like there were ethics to that. There were just certain things you didn't do, and there were certain people you didn't do them to, right?
Hmm.
And there were ways that you moved through the world with integrity, and I think that integrity is something that is relative to who you are and what your particular beliefs are, and but you need to be clear about what yours is, and what you will do, what you won't do. Um,
Yeah.
and so I think yeah, I just think that just became an important part of their narratives because it's an important part of mine, like as a Black woman, it was clear to me that when she told me that, she was telling me that because I was a Black woman, right? So that I didn't go into the world believing that it loved me as much as she did, to be honest with you. Yeah.
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 I
Hmm.
mean, that's a hard truth, and yet I feel like it's a truth, and there's beauty in that too, because it makes you, it's like, I know you are strong enough to make those decisions, right? And I know
Hmm.
you are strong enough to go into this world and decide who you want to be,
Yeah.
and it's really a coming of age moment, um, for anyone who has that. And in the book, right? It's this
Hmm.
idea, but also to look at other people around you, because I think your characters were also saying, well, what did my mother give up, right? Or
Yeah.
my father?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
and
Yeah. And negotiating that for themselves. Absolutely.
right.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And do I
I feel like
respect?
that happens in every story.
Yeah, but then I also think your characters were asking themselves, do I respect the decisions my parents
Yep.
made around this?
Hmm.
So,
Hmm. Hmm.
can you
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the parental, I guess, relations to your characters and that theme?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. In every genre in which I have written something about relationships between mothers and daughters. Like I wrote my dissertation on representations of Black motherhood in Afro diasporic women's literature.
I
um,
love that.
and- yeah, and without the slightest clue that I would be writing about it in this particular form, like I came to writing novels fairly recently in terms of the amount of time I've been a writer. So I think that just my deep interest in it in all of those different iterations, looking at it in the tradition of literature into which I'm writing, I think just kind of made it. I was destined to write about that in that way. But one interesting little nugget is of little fun fact about Maple Story is that I started Maple Story with the intention of writing about a healthy mother-daughter relationship because I was like, I'm always writing about like the really complicated and kind of unhealthy ones. I'm going to write about the mother and daughter who like love each other.
Uh-huh.
And I wrote the first scene where they're binge watching Atlanta, and got up to make dinner, and I was like in the kitchen cooking, and I heard a very small voice say, "The mother's supposed to be dead." And I was like, what? Like, no. What about my healthy relationship? And in that way, right? Like that
Uh-huh.
was one of the lessons about the book being smarter than I was, because I told myself I'll write about it for one day. My next writing session, I'll write as if the mother's dead. And if it doesn't work, I'm going back to my original plan. And it worked, and it worked, and the story just unfolded from there,
Uh-huh.
and yeah, and people's reactions to Maple Story, that they're like, I can't stop thinking about her. I'm like, that was a good decision because
Yeah.
I don't think her narrative would have been as powerful if I hadn't listened.
Yeah.
Um, so
Okay,
yeah.
but I keep thinking, I'm like, healthy mother-daughter relationships. Do I know
Okay.
any? Are they out there? I mean, it's almost part of growing up, right? You have to
Yeah,
step
yeah. But
away.
it's hard being a parent. Like that shit
Yeah.
looks hard. Like, I mean, like yeah, I'm like it's just complicated by
Yes.
nature. You have to
Yes.
prepare another human being for life. That
Yes.
sounds overwhelming. Like just the thought of it makes me anxious. So so yeah, I'm like, yeah, they're often complicated, but maybe that's just sort of yeah, that's just sort of part of human development. Like it's easier
Yeah.
for other species, but for us it's
I don't
weird.
know, but you laid that the complications, you laid them bare in these stories, right? And that makes them real for all of us. So I just
Thank you.
thought that was fantastic. All right, so I want to switch over for the last few minutes and ask you a little bit about craft. What is
Sure.
it like? I mean, you are an award-winning, right, lauded poet who comes up with this
Mhm.
amazing triptych, this short group of short stories here. What's it like to switch from poetry to longer form?
You know, it doesn't feel that different for me. The one difference is that, but actually, I believe this should also be true in prose, is that every word in poetry counts, right? And a word can have like multiple layers of meaning. That feels more intense with poetry, but I absolutely do that in prose. You know, like I know my book is long, but like every word in it was intentional. And so I think actually they inform each other for me in really interesting and profound ways. And even, you know, literary criticism, which is what I was training to do in my PhD program, I think helped me really craft things like Agnes's story, sort of that like austere language, of the literary critic, But also I think the skills there have also helped. I mean, just in like writing off the book essays. Like I feel like if I was not writing like 30-page papers at the age of 30, I might have lost those skills. and so um they really inform each other, I think, in some really interesting ways. And for me, it's just a lot of trial and error. My MFA is in poetry, and I was trained as a poet. I didn't really take any other kinds of workshops or things like that. And I think switching over to prose at first was just a way to do something new. But I also, I sort of started to borrow skills from those different genres and also kind of learn. You learn by reading good books, you learn by drafting and making mistakes and going back. And yeah, so
Yes.
yeah, I don't know. It feels just like another part of what I do and what I love to do.
Yes,
So,
writing is rewriting, the drafting
yeah.
and redrafting.
Yep.
So tell me, what was the hardest part about getting this book published?
Mm. Oh, the 2021, which was the book. I mean, I don't have a history in terms of like particularly like selling prose projects. So, I think in the grand scheme of things, it sold pretty fast. And, I love my editor. We have the same editor. I think she's amazing. The team at
Unbelievable.
Grand Central is amazing. But it felt like the year 2021 what like came at me like I am going to make your life exponentially harder between now and the publication of this book.
Oh
Like
no.
everything else that could go wrong that is not related to the book is going to go wrong.
Oh,
So for me,
sorry.
yeah, surviving the emotionally taxing onslaught of things that happened in 2021 was the hardest part of publishing this book. Writing it, I loved writing it. Revising and editing it, it's tough, but you get into a groove and it gets good and interesting and new things come up. And so it really
Yeah.
was like a joy to write this book. I mean, writing is work. I feel like too many people sort of presume that it's not, you're just sort
Right.
of sitting at your desk staring out the window. No, it is actual work.
Right.
But I've had a ton of jobs that I've really hated, and this one is the one I love the most. Yeah, it's
Oh, that's
hard.
amazing.
Yeah, yeah, I have a terrible job. Yeah, customer service, worked as a
Right.
server. Oh yeah, yeah, work
Yes.
that didn't leave me fulfilled in the way that writing does. And writing does that for me, even when it's hard, when it's scary, when I'm talking about things that um, I might not have gotten over and didn't realize that until I started writing about it. And I'm like, oh crap, I am not, I have not completely healed from that.
Yes.
In
But
spite
I'm
of
glad
all
that
of
happens to you because then I get to read it and it's so
yeah,
good.
yeah. In spite of all of that, I deeply enjoy making beautiful things out of words,
I
or
love
things that I
that.
hope are beautiful. So,
All right,
yeah.
so in 30 seconds or less, what kind of
Hmm.
advice do you have for new writers or aspiring writers?
Don't think about the book while you're writing. Write what you want. Write what comes to you. Trust your instincts, and hone your instincts. Everything in workshop is not going to help you. That's okay. It's not supposed to. Learn how to let your instincts teach you how to parse out what's useful and what's not useful. Yeah.
So good. Words of wisdom. Destiny, the book is amazing. Nobody's magic. Thank you so much for joining me. I love talking to you. I wish we had another hour. May you sell many, many copies.
Thank you so much. Yeah. From your lips.